So on paper, we had won. But in reality, two things, that was part one of our victory. The second point was, in 1967, the American higher command decided that Viet Cong guerrillas no longer existed and so they abolished them on paper. Just like American forces, we don't have any part-time guerrillas or full-time guerrillas. And also, do guerrillas have tanks? Do guerrillas have helicopters? Do guerrillas have heavy artillery? They don't have as much hardware as we do, so they aren't really a threat to American units. So several hundred thousand Viet Cong guerrillas were abolished from what's called the order of battle. So once you eliminate the guerrillas on paper, and then you have a lower total estimate of enemy forces, and you have an inflated estimate of how many of those you've killed, well, we'd won. Lyndon Johnson desperately needed a political victory in the fall of '67. So he got General Westmoreland to come back and say, we're winning, that we're soon going to enter into phase 3, and that is we're going to mop up for a couple of years. And what was happening in reality? In reality, the Viet Cong forces, the local forces, had expanded radically from 1964 through late 1967. According to U.S. figures, there were only about 200,000 Viet Cong. But when one CIA man started going through the files and trying to refigure things, he calculated about 500,000. And let's understand what that means. If the CIA man is doubling the estimate, that essentially means they don't have any idea of how many of them are there, but it means a double is probably the highest figure he can get away with and still be listened to by anyone. So, in reality, the enemy is gaining strength. We have through the Viet Cong. We have North Vietnamese participation still around 50,000 troops a year being sent south in the border zones along the Cambodian and Laotian borders and in certain the I Corps, the north of the country. And the U.S. strategic offensive had failed of search and destroy. The bombing operations had failed. In late January, early February 1968, the Viet Cong forces attacked en masse simultaneously for the first time. Normally, they fought very dispersed operations. They were not this was the first time there had been a simultaneous national attack. The attack succeeded in driving it ended the pacification war. All the units involved in pacification were driven out of the countryside into the cities. Almost all of the Vietnamese and American ground force units were driven out of the countryside back into the cities to defend the cities there. And some Viet Cong forces entered cities, Saigon, Hue, regional capitals, and we began to battle in the cities. Now what happened? After a few weeks, the Viet Cong withdrew from the cities. Their casualties were extremely high. They had not anticipated that the Americans would bomb and conduct artillery strikes inside the cities, but they did. So a large part of South Vietnam was reduced to rubble. Their casualties were high, but the Americans and South Vietnamese army units were gone from the countryside. Desertions had been massive, and the Viet Cong were able to recruit many people. Now that there were no opposing forces in the countryside, their political cadres were able to surface. So they were weakened in many ways, but on the other hand, they had achieved a decisive victory in driving their opponents out of the countryside. Now, from what is the legend then, because American forces were able to kill many of the commandos and Viet Cong troops inside the cities, the Americans of General Westmoreland declared victory. Of course, this ignores the fact that although he's driven the Viet Cong out of the cities, he himself has been driven out of the countryside, and they just made a mockery out of his own previous claims of victory. Also, it's clear to many people that there were far more enemies in South Vietnam than the Americans have been willing to admit. Westmoreland then made a troop request for another 200,000 soldiers. This troop request went under severe analysis. And essentially what was found was that if within the production model of war, if you were just going to fight the same kind of warfare but simply add more resources to it, still, the Viet Cong alone, just the people in the South, could fight on for another 4 or 5 years, or at least 3 years to 4 years, and then with any with significant North Vietnamese participation, they could fight on 10 to 20 years. In other words, we just could not drive the other side bankrupt.
And you're saying that the North Vietnamese Army basically hadn't participated
not
all
in
that
Tet,
much?
not in Tet. The North Vietnamese Army did not participate in Tet.
Okay.
In fact, in most of the war, they really played a minimal role when you consider the number of Viet Cong troops in proportion to the number of North Vietnamese
Well,
troops.
that's true up until 68. After 68, they entered the war in larger numbers.
Okay.
The Viet Cong were hit. In other words, certainly the conservative claim that the Viet Cong took severe losses in the Tet Offensive is true. The claim that they were decimated and defeated is false, and the claim that the Americans won Tet is false. Tet essentially helped American war managers, at least part of them, see that their strategy was bankrupt and that there was no path to victory.
So this finally created a...
Remember, Lyndon Johnson resigned somewhere during this period.
That's right, not too long afterward. Was this kind of a break in their self-delusion that Technowar would win everything?
Now here is a serious problem that people do not understand. American television news began from late 1968 on, began to report the idea that the war was winding down and that we were on our way out. This is not true. This is a false statement. You should never believe this. When you look at the casualty figures of how many American soldiers were killed from 65 through 68, through 67, and then you take 68, and then you look 69 through 73. The 69 through 73 is just about, is within a couple of hundred as high as the number of killed 65 through 67.
So
in other words, search and destroy continued way on until late 71.
So what was it then that finally convinced the U.S. foreign policy establishment or the U.S. public that Vietnam couldn't be won?
From mid-68 on, the American military began to become progressively more restless, and certainly by late 69 and 70s in active revolt against its commanders. Remember that 75% of the battles in Vietnam were initiated by the enemy, and the average American grunt spent his tour of duty, those few who were combat troops, spent his tour of duty walking into ambushes. Most men learned fairly quickly that while they were walking into ambushes that their generals were getting medals and they were safe in helicopters and so on and so forth. So people began what's called fragging. Fragging means you take a fragmentation grenade and you throw it at your superior, whether it's a non-commissioned officer or sergeant or a lieutenant or a captain or whatever. It was a way to tell higher command not to treat the ground troops' lives frivolously, that they would not aggressively pursue dangerous combat situations that simply in order to make the superiors look good. And the estimates run quite high. In other words, the official Army count is about 650 fragging incidents, and there are real reasons to doubt that, because let's say...
It must have been quite small. I'm sure there were a lot of them that weren't reported.
Oh, of course, because no commander wants to have, what do you say, it's like some of my own men threw a grenade at me or tried to shoot me. I mean, how is that going to look good on your record? Are you going to get promoted up as a great leader when you're reporting that your own people are shooting at you? No, I'm sure the records the figures must be substantially higher.
The soldiers even put pools of money out for contracts for particularly unpopular officers.
But there was also suicide and self-mutilation that went on, too.
People got desperate. They were disoriented. They were not being cared for by their own command. The actual operations often involve slaughter of innocents. Suicide rates are fairly high. Standing up in the middle of a firefight. There's one famous cartoon book by a man named Tad Forrester, and it shows a picture of a soldier hiding behind a rock with his trigger finger in the air looking for the $1 million wound. The theory being like if he exposed this and got his index finger shot off, that he could get out of the war zone. Or you don't take your malaria pill, and get therefore removed because you're incapacitated with malaria. There were many ways where people shooting themselves in the foot. There are lots and lots of stories of self-mutilation. Or you do it to your friend. In other words, if your friend has, say, been wounded twice and you're on a particularly dangerous mission and he's had a premonition of death, which was taken very, very seriously. All combat soldiers are deeply superstitious. Then sometimes you shoot or you stab your friend, not in a vital place, but to wound them enough to get them out.
You
You can't fight a war this way. You cannot fight a war where people are, or you go and search and avoid.
Also,
yeah, search and avoid. That was a very prevalent thing too. Instead of search and destroy, search and avoid.
That is, you go out and you play war. You try to you go out and you smoke some dope or and you fake some radio reports, or you generally try not to engage the enemy. Yes.